Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Cameron Consarini, the Policy Director for NUFDI, the National Union for Democracy in Iran. Before we begin today's forum, I'd just like to remind everyone of a few housekeeping notes. If you do have questions for the Congressman, who will be introduced in just a moment, please use the Zoom Q&A function. You put your questions there, and I will address them and gather them and put them to the Congressman if they are relevant. If you're joining us through the YouTube or Facebook live stream, please ask your questions in the comments section, and we'll also be monitoring those to address them to the Congressman. As you might imagine, the Congressman has quite a busy schedule. We're thankful for his time. So today will be a shorter than normal event. We'll go about half an hour and try and pack as much in. I'd like to reiterate that NUFDI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that does not engage in electioneering. These conversations are meant to be educational and endorsements. We're very thankful for the Congressman's time. With that said, I will pass off to Dr. Saeed Ganji, the President and Chairman of NUFDI.
Good morning to our friends joining us from across the country and beyond. My name is Saeed Ganji, and I'm the President and Chairman of the National Union for Democracy in Iran. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to this, our first NUFDI Congressional Forum. NUFDI, as you know, is a nonpartisan, non-profit organization of Iranian American based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to supporting the cause of human rights, freedom, and democracy in Iran. As the situation in Iran gets more serious by the day, and the Iranian people, of course, silenced by the Islamic Republic, look to those of us abroad to share their demand and struggle with the world, we launched this new effort and serve as a forum for the discussion of these most crucial issues. Today's topic, the Islamic Republic's meddling in the region, abuses of human rights, and U.S. policy towards Iran, arises out of the Islamic Republic well-established and undisputed track record of abuses of human rights, meddling in the domestic affair of other countries, and sponsoring terrorism worldwide. On behalf of NUFDI, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today to discuss this important topic, and it is a particular honor to address these issues crucial to our community with the distinguished Member of Congress, Representative Andy Biggs, the Chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. To introduce the Honorable Congressman Biggs, I would like to welcome Dr. Renee Bainfar, one of our board members. Dr. Bainfar, mic is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ganji. As an Arizonan, I'm particularly privileged to make the introduction. Congressman Biggs is an Arizona native, currently serving his second term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Arizona's 5th District. He and his wife of 38 years have 6 children and 6 grandchildren. He completed his bachelor's degree in Asian Studies from Brigham Young University, his master's in political science from Arizona State University, and his Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Arizona. He is a retired attorney who has been licensed to practice law in Arizona, Washington, and New Mexico. And before being elected to Congress, he served in the Arizona legislature for 14 years, the last 4 as Arizona Senate President. Congressman Biggs is a member of the House Judiciary and Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He's also chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. Thank you for your service to Arizona and for your willingness to be a voice for the freedom-seeking people of Iran. Please welcome Congressman Andy Biggs.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Thanks for that nice introduction, Dr. Bainfar and Dr. Ganji. It's good to be with all of you again today. And I'm flattered that you would give me just a few minutes of your time to spend with you talking about what I consider to be a very important issue, dealing with the human rights and the self-determination of the Iranian people, which I think is so critical. And so I will give a few opening statements, I guess, and then we'll do questions, if that's all right. It's clear from my observation and from what I see from reporting that there's a majority of Iranians who do not want to live under the brutal conditions that they live in today. It's extremely unfortunate that most Iranians have never known a better government. I support the Trump administration's efforts to punish the brutal regime and prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons, at the same time trying to leverage that regime into providing more human rights and recognition of the self-determination of the Iranian people. My one major hope, and I think that the Trump administration probably agrees with me on this, is that we are able to encourage this better behavior without resorting to war, but resorting to political leveraging. Generally speaking, my foreign policy views are grounded in realism, which should never be confused or conflated with disengagement, let alone isolationism, even though the foreign policy establishment in DC often follows an intervene first mentality and loves to try to paint politicians like me with an absurdly broad brush. At the most extreme level, I believe that invading and rebuilding foreign nations in our own idealistic image has actually failed in recent decades, as evidenced by wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Is it good for the U.S. to conduct carefully targeted counter-terrorist operations against those who want to bring harm to the U.S. homeland? Yes, of course. But nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan has failed and has cost our nation trillions of dollars and thousands of U.S. lives. I worry that an armed intervention by the U.S. into Iran, followed by a nation building exercise, would have similarly devastating impacts here and actually there. It would likely also take the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iranians. Thankfully, I don't think we have to worry about the U.S. getting ensnared in an actual war with Iran anytime soon. I can't imagine Iran's leadership wants tensions to escalate to that point, and nor does President Trump. And anyway, Iran is dealing with plenty of its own problems at the moment, including COVID-19. Should such a war break out, the U.S. would certainly win the initial struggle, but it would be a much tougher and more expensive slog than the war with Iraq. And in all likelihood, any efforts at post-war rebuilding would fail as badly in Tehran as they did in Baghdad. For instance, we could look at the destabilization of Iraq and the rise of Shiite militia in Iraq, which only serves to strengthen Iran's hand, by the way, in that area. So again, while war can never be fully off the table, it would likely be a very bad option. Given that war is a bad option, our nation should instead continue to deter Iran without accelerating tensions beyond the breaking point. And this requires some sophisticated tightrope walking in diplomacy. It also requires the courage to act when necessary. For instance, I supported the president's decision in January to strike Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who were working not just with Shiite militia in Iraq, but also terrorist groups like Hezbollah to destabilize the entire region. And it seems clear now that this strike, far from driving the U.S. and Iran closer to war, as critics were saying, actually provided the necessary fear in the Iranians to change at least some of their actions, if not their rhetoric. In the immediate days that followed after a purposely ineffectual missile retaliation that didn't kill a single American service member, Iran backed down from any further hostilities, although they still try to provoke some kind of confrontation ostensibly. I'm not sure that how sincere they are in their provocation efforts. The U.S. needs to continue to show that it's not afraid to use force when absolutely necessary, although it should be tactical and limited. On the issue of the JCPOA, I believe Trump administration made the right decision to exit this arrangement because it did not go far enough toward ensuring that Iran would never be able to build a nuclear weapon, or at least under this regime. Meanwhile, we know for certain that it did not stop Iran's reckless international behavior on other fronts. It continued after the JCPOA was signed to support President Bashar al-Assad's ghastly regime in Syria, the Houthi militia in Yemen, and the subversive and destabilizing activities of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's not the behavior of a country that truly wants to join the ranks of normalized nation states. So I think the maximum pressure strategy of President Trump is important. He has begun by reimposing punishing sanctions on Iran. I'll just go over what those are and explain concerns I have with that. The purchase or acquisition of U.S. banknotes by Iran, Iran's trade in gold and other precious metals, transactions in the Iranian rial, activities relating to Iran's issuing of sovereign debt, and transactions with Iran in graphite, aluminum, steel, coal, and industrial software, restrictions on importation of Iranian luxury goods to the U.S., the sale to Iran of passenger aircraft, petroleum-related transactions with Iran, and transactions by foreign banks with Iran's central banks, including the provision that restricts Iran's access to hard currency held in banks abroad. These sanctions are meant to really hurt, and they seem to be doing significant damages to Iran's economy. Its GDP growth rate is contracted by more than 5% between 2018 and 2020. The good thing is that this economic pain is disproportionately felt by the Iranian elite, although the bad thing is that all sections of the population feel it. and that's why it's almost impossible to sanction the elite without touching the people that we don't really want to touch, which is the Iranian street. Imposing sanctions is a delicate art. If they're too heavy-handed, they could potentially spur popular nationalist backlash and end up being counterproductive. I don't think that's been the situation so far with Iran, and so I would advocate for keeping the screws tight and focusing on identifying leaders and issuing those sanctions on those individual leaders to really tighten the screws on them and try to get them to a negotiating table and see if we can make changes through that incentive. In time, these punishing sanctions should squeeze the current regime out of existence altogether, and might do so. Finally, let me say how encouraged I was by the news about Israel, UAE, and Bahrain establishing diplomatic relations. Although the current Iranian regime has never gotten along particularly well with much of the Arab world, it has always sought to sow pan-Muslim antagonism toward Israel. An Israel-UAE-Bahrain relationship damages that message and makes Iran look even further out of touch and isolated. And as we see more Arab nations discussing coming to the table and normalizing those relations, it has the potential to further isolate Iran's government and hopefully bring stability elsewhere in the region, which would again further isolate Iran. So there's some positives always going on, but I think it's hard to find a short-term solution to what is a vexing, multi-decades-long problem. And so those are my opening remarks, and I thank you for letting me make them to you today.
Thank you so much. Your thoughts are most appreciated, certainly by our community. You made one point which I wanted to reiterate, and that I think certainly everyone on this call would agree strongly with, that war is the worst option on the table. And I think oftentimes that is used almost as a straw man argument by others on the other side to say, you have to appease this regime because the only alternative is war. And we're all on the same page that war is not a good option for the United States, for the American people, and also not good for the people of Iran. But many would have discussed a third option, which is similar in many ways to what President Reagan did with the Soviet Union. While he was pushing on nuclear talks and reduction with the Soviets, he was also very strong and very powerful in his insistence on engaging with the democratic forces in the Soviet Union, in Poland, solidarity, things like that. Being bold enough to stand in Berlin and say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Do you see any such opportunity in Iran while maintaining pressure on the regime to end their nuclear program and their meddling in the region, which you referred to so well? Is there an opportunity to also, without engaging in arms or militarily, support the democratic forces and secular opposition in Iran to this brutal regime?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we need to engage with them. I think we need to highlight to the rest of the world. So much of the world doesn't even understand that there is a pro-democratic population in Iran. And I think that you really have to engage them. Now, I think where we have blundered as the United States in the past is where we have sent signals that we would supply materiel should there be an uprising of some kind. And I think that has been dangerous because we've never followed through in some, not just in Iran, but I'm talking about just generally around the world in multiple locations. I think we need to overtly engage democratic forces in Iran and those who are outside of Iran who seek to bring democratic ideals to Iran. And I think that's not nation building. What that is recognizing that there are people who are sincere and want to have a regime change, and we can encourage that without stepping across the line into engaging in actually open conflict militarily with the regime in Iran today. I believe that, yes, and I would support that, and hopefully we can see that as the next rail going forward if should this president be reelected.
We're so reassured to hear that, and we appreciate it, and we look forward to down the road working with you more on that. It's a very principled stand, and I can tell you that the people of Iran appreciate it. I mean, you mentioned in your remarks the impact that that American policy has on the people, and I'm not sure if you've heard this before, but it may reassure you. As you know, the government, the regime in Iran will have these demonstrations where they force people to say "Death to America," "Death to Israel," things like that. But actually, the Iranian people, in their very widespread protests, one of their most popular chants, they will respond and say, in English translation is, "Our enemy is right here. They lie when they say it's America." So the people of the United States are the people of Iran, are certainly on board with this, and I think appreciate your stand of solidarity. You mentioned, Congressman, this this deal between the Israelis, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, and perhaps other countries coming on board. Many have remarked that this is obviously a great step. It's certainly a diplomatic achievement for the president. It's a great step for the region. Many in Iran have said, many of the democratic forces that you referred to say that although this is a great step, it won't be as successful as it ultimately could be until a free, secular, democratic Iran is part of that process. Basically, until the people have established that democratic state that you referred to. How do you imagine, it's sort of, thinking outside the box, but how do you imagine, do you see a world where you could have the Israelis and the Arabs, like the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, and a free Iran sort of coming together to take control of the region and build it to be more prosperous and free without the United States having to consistently be involved in the region? Do you see such a world in the future potentially?
Well, let me just say, there's been so much history of for decades and maybe centuries of animosities that have gone back and forth. My hope is that we can get there, and one of the things that I would love to see happen is for us to basically, and I think this is the way it has to happen in some respects, is we foment or foster and support the normalization of relations between Israel and Arab nations in the region. And as we do that, I think that provides the stability, again, to isolate this Iranian regime. And as that regime becomes isolated, and if the democratic forces can come to some kind of control, the secular democratic forces within Iran can come in and take leadership of that nation, I would imagine that everybody could peacefully coexist. I'm a big believer in that. I think that's the ideal. I'm afraid it may take some time, but you know what? If we aren't trying now, then we'll never get there. So we have to keep taking the steps toward that wholesome objective, I think.
Now, you mentioned, Congressman, the president's maximum pressure policy that you do support, and sort of your thoughts on a second Trump turn, what that might look like. What do you imagine would the outcome be, or what would this policy look like as we look at a potential second term for President Trump? Do you see it changing in any way? What would your guidance be to him as Iran policy goes into his second term?
So my guidance would involve 3 or 4 things. Number one, I think he has to, as you mentioned, he has to engage certainly rhetorically with the pro-democrat individuals within the population, those who want a secular democrat Iran. I think that's important. I think the second thing is they need to have, where possible, to identify with very great specificity the individuals that have been problematic and bring those sanctions to bear directly on them. And there are ways to do that mechanically. And so I think that's something that you do. The third thing I think is you have to do, continue with a movement to bring improve relations that the U.S. has and our allies in that region with each other. So we're very clearly communicating, we get on the same page with regard to trying to bring more stability to the region and bring peaceful conclusions to some of these areas where you see military conflict right now. And then the fourth thing I think is really important is I think the U.S. needs to quite frankly, keep itself somewhat a presence there to provide some kind of a backup. I want our troops removed as much as possible and get out of harm's way, but they need to be there at least in close range, so that the Iranian regime doesn't feel like it can march all over the place and foment even more terror and more military conflict. That doesn't mean that the U.S. has to take a primary role in that. They can take a secondary, tertiary role. They can sit back and encourage regional partners to try to resolve issues in that way. But that's what I would say we need to move on in probably those four areas in the first year to 18 months of a second term.
Those 4 points make complete sense, and I appreciate it. I think we've got time for one or two more questions, if that's okay with you. And I know you've got several things to get to, so we won't keep you too much past that time. We're appreciative of how generous you've been already. One question that we see a lot from Iranian Americans and the sort of the secular democratic forces in the country, they have a very good experience. They have a lot of experience, Congressman, with this regime. They have had their family members killed, tortured, put in jail for, we have this case this week of Navid Afkari. I mean, his only quote unquote crime was attending a protest. And for that, he was executed. Many people, Iranian Americans, your constituents, those democratic forces in Iran, they're concerned about the insistence on making some sort of a deal with this regime, because based on their experience and the inhumanity of this regime, they believe that the regime won't stand by any deal that it signs. What is your view on that? And how, I know one thing you mentioned, which I know means a lot to so many people, and we appreciate, is this engagement of democratic forces, sort of the signs. I think that is so critical, and we're so thankful you said that. What is your response to those who would say this regime simply will not stand by its word? They will not act according to any document that they sign.
Well, I think history has proven that this regime, anything that they overtly agree to, you can take with a healthy bit of skepticism that they will actually follow through or adhere to it. I think that there are regimes, there are several regimes around the world, and I would place this regime in that category, where they're going to be very, very slow to come to the table. And then when they do get to the table, they're going to make an agreement that they think is beneficial to them. And then they'll feel very comfortable in violating that agreement if they think it forwards their initiatives. And I'm not big on multilateral international tribunals because I don't think they do a great job, and they inherently are biased. But I think that what needs to happen here is a lot of these need to end up into the International Court in The Hague, where these human rights violations that are so rampant that you've discussed can be brought forward, if for no other reason, to force Iran, this regime, to face those allegations in a very public way. And even though I think I'm dubious about the ability to enforce anything at that level, but which is one of the reasons I'm so skeptical about it. But I also think what it does do is it brings a way to shine the light. And the other thing I would say is, I am so shocked at the way the UN blithely ignores the human rights violations that seem to be pervasive in Iran. And so I would also, I'm not a big believer in the UN. I think it's a failed institution. But as long as it's there, I think the U.S. should use it as a tool for a lot of these regimes that are violating the human rights of individuals around the world, including Iran.
That was fantastic. I think your point about The Hague was absolutely well taken. There are many people who are leaving comments and questions saying that they hope that once again a free Iran can establish good relations with the United States, with Israel, as it had pre-1979.
1979, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
I hope we can get there. I hope in collaboration with you, we can get there. I want to thank you again for your time. I do not want to take up more of it. There are many questions remaining for our friends. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to speak with you again, but you have been very generous with us today. We're extremely thankful for your time and for your guidance. And I hope to be able to continue this conversation with you. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cameron. Thanks to everybody who's listening and asking questions, and God bless you guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.